A Fox News alert and a huge ruling from the D.C. Court of Appeals. It hands down a decision that is a major setback for Obamacare. Just happened moments ago. Good morning to you. I'm John Scott.
How much of a setback? What does it mean for customers? Those are big questions today. Hi, everybody. I'm Jenna Lee, and the court is striking down this key part of Obamacare, the subsidies for some customers, and that will have major consequences for millions of people getting tax credits through the federal exchanges. Many states are using these federal exchanges. Shannon Bream is live in Washington with more on what we're learning just now. Shannon?
Well, Jenna, this is a tough blow to the administration, and it could totally change the equation with respect to how Obamacare works moving forward. The IRS had interpreted the law to mean that subsidies for helping to cover the cost of insurance could be extended into 36 states which chose not to set up exchanges, despite what the plaintiffs argued was the plain language of the law, that those subsidies were only for states that had the exchanges. Well, today, this federal appeals court based here in D.C. agreed with the plaintiffs. I want to read you a little bit from that decision. Judge Griffith writing for the court saying, within constitutional limits, Congress is supreme in matters of policy, and the consequence of that supremacy is that our duty when interpreting a statute is to ascertain the meaning of the words of the statute duly enacted through the legislative formal process. Well, having done that, going through the analysis of what was written and what the law actually says, the court decided going forward and noting, saying, although our decision has major consequences, our role is quite limited, deciding whether the IRS rule is a permissible reading of the ACA. They said it wasn't. They said it's got to go back to the lower court and be reconsidered. The dissent, of course, disagreed. Here it was the senior Judge Edwards saying the plaintiffs had only one goal. He said, quote, this case is about the appellant's not so veiled attempt to gut the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act. He knows, all three of the judges who made this decision know, that it is going to have a significant impact. We are awaiting reaction now from the administration. A couple of things can happen here. The government can ask for what's called an en banc hearing. That's where they'd ask every judge who sits on this federal court, the D.C. Circuit, not just the three who heard this case, to rehear and decide the whole thing as a whole. Now, you may remember this is the court that the president was very aggressive about making sure he got 3 appointments. They changed the rules in the Senate. He got 3 appointments onto that bench. So now it does lean in favor of Democratic appointees. They could go that route, or eventually where it's probably going to end up is at the Supreme Court. Of course, there is no guarantee the justices will agree to take up this case. That's probably in the time frame of a year or two. We'll have to wait and see what the administration does now, but a big loss for them in trying to uphold the law and make it work with those subsidies today.
So quickly, Jenna? And I know this is still very much developing, while the politics play out and while we watch what happens in the courts, what about all these millions of people who have received subsidies through the federal exchanges? Are they guaranteed to get those subsidies as they look to next year and signing up for their health care? What happens to them?
There's got to be a lot of scrambling going on right now by the administration's lawyers, by IRS lawyers, by everyone who's been involved in those decisions. My guess is that right now, while this case is remanded back to the lower court for some further proceedings, that everything will stay in place. Possibly an injunction will be put in place. The government may ask for that or ask for some clarity to make sure that people know how they can and can't proceed while this case is ongoing. I would think that things would operate as usual for now, but we'll have to wait and see. There's a lot of unknown in the wake of this decision, which caught a lot of folks by surprise today.
Fascinating news. Shannon, thank you.
Let's talk about all of this with Bret Baier, the anchor of Special Report, of course. Karl Rove is a Fox News contributor, former advisor to President George W. Bush. So, Bret, has the D.C. Circuit Court here done what Republicans have been struggling to do for years?
Clearly, this is a big blow to the Obama administration. It's a big blow to the health care law. That said, supporters of Obamacare, like Families USA, a group that's kind of advocated for it, Ron Pollock is the director over there, they feel confident that this thing is going to get stayed and then overturned by, as Shannon mentioned, the en banc, or the whole court. That's the 11 members of this court. There's a similar case in the Fourth Circuit that is also moving forward. The big question here is whether, if this stays in place, you have essentially obliterated the whole system of premium subsidies for 36 states. Remember, there are only 14 states which are running their own state-run exchanges. The rest have this federal-run system, and if this ruling stays in place, it would essentially obliterate Obamacare.
So what about the politics of this, Carl? I mean, the president has long screamed at Republicans for trying to undo the law that he calls his signature law. Now it's a federal court saying you just can't do this. How does he handle that at the White House?
Yeah, this is a little bit of a tricky PR problem for the White House because it just makes sense. The heart of the Halbig decision is that the law is written in a way that says only states who run their own exchanges will get subsidies. And, the ordinary people are going to look at that and say, you pass this law in the middle of the night. Nancy Pelosi famously said we need to pass it in order to understand what's in it. And you made a mistake. And now you can't undo it because you can't go back to Congress and say, please allow all 50 states to get subsidies. That's never going to pass the House of Representatives, which wants to repeal and replace Obamacare. So they got a real PR problem here, and it's going to cause some consequences. Remember, these 36 states include very big states like Pennsylvania, Ohio, Texas, Florida. More than half the people in the country live in those states, and as of now, their subsidies are very much up in the air. I'm not certain that the court is going to necessarily allow the government to continue to pay for those subsidies during a period where this decision is being reconsidered.
Yeah, interesting, Brett, because, most of us remember how this thing got passed in the first place when the Senate kind of snuck it through on the smoke and mirrors concept of reconciliation. As Carl points out, there's no way that the House of Representatives is going to go back and adopt language to the Affordable Care Act that the president wants here. That's not going to happen. So they're stuck with what they passed.
Right, they are. I think, to Shannon's point, you could conceivably get favorable judges in the federal court system that say that it was Congress's intent that these states that even are run by federal exchanges get subsidies. And just to quote from Ron Pollock again, the supporter of Obamacare, just to give a fair and balanced decision here, today's decision represents the high watermark for Affordable Care Act opponents, but the water will recede very quickly. The bottom line here, John, is that even supporters acknowledge that this law is under attack. And when you talk about the politics of this decision opens up the door again to all of these races around the country where Obamacare is kind of an underlying issue, and it's simmering. There are stories now about narrow networks where people are complaining about having to go different places throughout a state to get to health care where they didn't have to before. There are a number of different things that will factor in November, and this is obviously a ruling that brings it all up.
And Carl, we're certainly going to be talking a lot about the midterm elections, and we were going to talk about that, and we will in just a few minutes with you before we had this breaking news. It's worth pointing out, though, that there has been 41 different delays or changes to the health care law since it's been passed. So our viewers are probably used to hearing about changes or delays so far, and as Brent mentioned, it still is simmering, but it's quiet now as far as when we're talking about politics. Health care isn't topping the list. Yeah. How is this the same as those 41 delays or changes, or how could it be different?
Well, it's going to cause the people who do have insurance coverage through the exchanges with subsidies. Not everybody who gets their insurance through the exchanges incidentally gets a subsidy, but it's going to cause those in those 36 states to say, what's the effect going to be? But it's also going to cause people who have private insurance. And remember, 2/3 of the people who have coverage from their employers get them through an ERISA plan. That's a law passed in 1974 that allows them to operate outside the Affordable Care Act's purview. And 1/3 of the people get their coverage from insurance that is subject to Obamacare, and a small percentage of those, a small number of those, get it through the exchanges themselves. And everybody who's not part of Obamacare with a subsidy is going to be saying, why is it somebody who sort of looks like me and is in my neighborhood getting money from the federal government, from my pocket as a taxpayer, in order to subsidize their coverage if they're sort of like me. And so we're going to have that kind of dynamic going on out there. I do think this issue remains very close to the top of the mind for those who are going to be voting in this fall's election, and it's intensely unpopular. All these surveys show that by a margin of better than 2 to 1, the strongly opposes outnumber the strongly supports.
Brett, your final.
Let me just point out one thing,
ahead.
Jenna,
Yes.
and that is another aspect of this that factors in potentially for November, and that is the importance of federal appointments to the bench and how much that means in the big picture. Not only factors in 2014, but obviously in 2016. You'll have Supreme Court nominees and open vacancies likely down the road. But this shows you the impact of a federal court decision potentially on something as big and complex as Obamacare.
Big questions about where it goes from here, but obviously the implications are serious. It's nice to have you both. Brett, Carl, Carl's going to be back. We're going to get a twofer with Carl. Brett, we're going to get a twofer at 6 p.m. where we get to see you on Special Report. All right,
Sounds
gentlemen,
good.
thank you.